The Vampire-Lycan War, sometimes known as the Eternal War, is the name of the conflict currently being waged between vampires and Lycans in the Underworld universe. After the end of the Vampire-Werewolf War and the capture of William Corvinus, the Lycan species evolved, beginning with Lucian. The Lycans were kept as slaves by the vampires, favored over the werewolves because they were more intelligent and docile. Under the vampires, the Lycans suffered captivity and mistreatment, dreaming of one day gaining their freedom. The war officially began in the early 15th century when Lucian rebelled against the vampire elder Victor after being forced to witness the brutal execution of his pregnant lover, Victor's own daughter, Sonia. Lucian swore eternal vengeance against Victor for the loss of Sonia and their unborn child. He led his kin, whom Sonia had previously helped escape, and a pack of surviving werewolves to raid the Corvinus castle, nearly destroying the entire Budapest coven and freeing the remaining slaves. Victor swore vengeance against Lucian and the Lycans for their defiance. After this, Victor altered the recorded vampire history to omit the Lycan slavery in any mention of his daughter, making it appear that the Lycans were to blame for starting the war and that their violence was unjust, whereas in reality, the Lycans were originally retaliating against the brutality of their former masters. In the 15th century, the Death Dealers led an assault on the Corvinus castle, which Lucian had taken as his own fortress, and burned it to the ground. Nearly all the Death Dealers involved in the battle were killed, but the vampires seemed to gain a great victory when the only surviving Death Dealer, named Craven, claimed to have killed Lucian, presenting Lucian's branded skin as proof. In reality, however, Lucian was still alive, as Craven had made a deal with him. Lucian would fake his death so that Craven could gain Victor's favor, and in return, they would help each other to end the war and kill the Elders, allowing Craven to take control of the Coven. This plan worked for a time, with Craven growing in power over the centuries while Lucian remained hidden, presumably orchestrating the war from the shadows and waiting for his moment. Despite Lucian's supposed death, the war continued into the 21st century, 6 centuries after it began. The Lycans rarely managed to cooperate or organize sophisticated attacks, giving the vampires the upper hand, and by the early 21st century, the number of Lycans had dwindled considerably. Unbeknownst to both species, the first immortal, Alexander Corvinus, and his private human army, known as the Cleaners, worked to ensure that the war remained hidden from the public. Although things seemed bleak for the Lycans, they continued to adapt. Older Lycans learned how to transform at will, instead of only under the full moon, making them deadlier than ever. With the help of former vampire historian Andreas Tanis, they also developed ultraviolet ammunition that burned vampires as if exposed to sunlight, giving them a slight advantage. Lucian sought to end the war by becoming the first hybrid, half vampire, half Lycan, and stronger than both. To achieve this, he needed the blood of a vampire elder and the blood of a descendant of Alexander Corvinus's third son, who carried a dormant version of the Corvinus strain. It was discovered that the mortal Michael Corvin was a descendant of Corvinus's third son, and the Lycans made it their primary mission to capture him. Their plans were disrupted by the Death Dealer's Selene, despite Craven's efforts to keep things quiet in time for the arrival of the reigning elder, Amelia, who was returning to Budapest to awaken the next elder in the chain, Marcus Corvinus. Lucian managed to bite Michael, turning him into a Lycan and obtaining a blood sample that tested positive for the Corvinus strain. However, things became complicated when Selene, suspecting that Craven had betrayed her race after seeing Lucian alive, awakened Victor 200 years ahead of schedule to seek his help. The Lycans successfully ambushed Amelia and the Vampire Council, killing them and draining Amelia's blood. However, Lucian was betrayed and mortally wounded by Craven before he could inject himself with the blood. Victor, upon learning that Lucian was alive, led a group of Death Dealers to the Lycan den, where a fierce battle erupted. Selene, having developed feelings for Michael, tried to help him escape, only for a jealous Craven to shoot him with silver nitrate. Fortunately, at the insistence of a dying Lucian, Selene bit Michael, turning him into a hybrid and saving his life. Later, Selene killed Victor after discovering that he had lied about the origins of the war and had murdered her family, having previously blamed the Lycans to ensure her loyalty. The remaining Lycans allowed Selene and Michael to leave unharmed, and the pair became fugitives. They recovered Sonia's pendant from Lucian in the process, unaware that it was actually one of the keys to William's prison. Craven and the vampires loyal to him attempted to kill Marcus before he could awaken, which would allow Craven to take control. However, Marcus had already awakened and unknowingly became a hybrid after ingesting the blood of a dead Lycan named Singe. Marcus killed Craven's men, and from their blood memories, learned of Craven's betrayal and that Selene knew the location of his twin brother William's prison. He also discovered that his father had designed the prison and had taken Selene there when she was a child. Marcus burned down the vampire mansion, destroying what remained of the Old World Coven before pursuing Selene and Michael to retrieve the pendant and learn the location of his brother's prison. Marcus managed to obtain the keys and the location, freeing William. He attempted to turn him into a hybrid and destroy the vampire and Lycan races to create a new species, but he was thwarted by Selene, who became the first vampire Corvinus hybrid after Marcus's dying father, Alexander, offered her his blood, and by Michael, who killed Marcus's brother. For about a decade, the war was on hold, so to speak, as after Alexander and the Cleaners departed, knowledge of the Immortals finally leaked to humanity. In response to the perceived threat, humanity enacted the purges, essentially a massive genocide against Lycans and vampires, forcing them into hiding. During the first purge, Selene and Michael were captured and kept in cryogenic stasis for 12 years. The war turned in favor of the Lycans after they managed to take control of Antigen, a company supposedly dedicated to finding a cure for the infection. In reality, the Lycans were seeking ways to increase their power. Antigen obtained Michael and Selene, as well as Eve, their daughter whom Selene had been unknowingly pregnant with at the time of her capture. Using Antigen as the company conducting tests on Lycans and vampires, the Lycans were able to deceive humans into believing they were extinct, allowing them to rebuild their numbers. 12 years after the purges, Eve learns of Antigen's plans to dissect her to turn all Lycans into hybrids. The Lycan leader and head of Antigen, Dr. Jacob Lane, and his son Quint had already used Eve's DNA to become hybrids, although Quint was more powerful due to receiving more injections of the serum created from Eve's blood. Eve managed to escape and free Selene, who joins Thomas's coven, one of the last remaining vampire covens. To get Eve back, the Lycans launched a full-scale attack, revealing the extent of their survival. Although several Lycans were killed, the coven was decimated, Eve was captured, and David, the son of the coven leader Thomas and the vampire elder Amelia, died. Selene resurrected David as a vampire Corvinus hybrid like herself before setting out to rescue Eve and stop the Lycans' plot. With the help of Detective Sebastian, Selene is able to determine that Antigen is actually run by the Lycans and is where Eve has been taken. Alongside Detective Sebastian and taking advantage of her immunity to sunlight, Selene attacks Antigen as the Lycans prepare to dissect Eve. With Detective Sebastian's help, Selene kills most of the Lycans at Antigen and breaks Michael's containment tent before being forced to fight Quint while Eve battles Jacob. Quint and Jacob are killed by Selene and Eve respectively, while David arrives to take down the remaining Lycans. After the fight, Selene, David, and Eve discover that Michael has escaped and realize that the Lycans will be hunting him. After the fall of Antigen, the Lycans continued to hunt Selene, but seemed to lack a central leader for a while. Eventually, Marius became a new Lycan leader, uniting hundreds of Lycans under his command and destroying several vampire covens, drastically turning the tide of the war in favor of the Lycans. Marius also captured and killed Michael Corvin, using his blood to become a Lycan Corvinus hybrid with the plan to find Eve and use her blood to become even stronger. Despite the number of Lycans Marius had under his command, he lacked the strength needed to destroy the Eastern Coven without Eve's blood. Due to the severity of the threat posed by Marius, the Vampire Council agreed to pardon Selene if she trained their new death dealers to fight Marius. However, Selene is betrayed and framed by Samira in an act of revenge and to cement her own power. After Selene escapes to the Nordic Coven, Samira sends the death dealer Alexia after her. Alexia is secretly Marius's lover and leads the Lycans to the Nordic Coven, where a battle ensues with heavy casualties on both sides. After learning that Selene does not know where Eve is in her apparent death, the Lycans abandon the fight with the Nordic vampires. With Alexia's help, the Lycans are able to break through the defenses of the Eastern Coven and protect themselves from bullets with Riot's shields. As a tactic, the Lycans also create holes in the walls of the Eastern Coven to use sunlight as a weapon. The Lycans nearly win before Selene, with her powers greatly enhanced by the Nordic Coven's sacred ritual, returns with the Nordic vampires as reinforcements. Selene ultimately kills Marius, and after David proves the death of their leader by presenting his head to the Lycans, the surviving Lycans retreat. After Marius's death, the Lycans are once again left without a central leader, shifting the tide in favor of the vampires. Selene believes that this defeat will potentially lead to a time of peace for the vampires to rebuild their two surviving covens. The vampires, lacking any central leadership since the deaths of Amelia, Victor, and Marcus, choose Selene, David, and the Nordic vampire Lena as the new vampire elders, restoring central leadership to the vampire race. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed my video, I'd love to recommend another one for you to watch.